The narrative of this conflict has taken a sudden, violent, and highly predictable turn. For months, the most intensive front, the battle for Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, was defined by desperate infantry infiltration and motorcycle assaults, tactics born out of the Russian military's fear of sacrificing its last remaining armored vehicles to Ukrainian drones. That era of caution is over. The Russian command has now made a catastrophic, high-stakes decision. The mechanized columns are back. This isn't a sign of strength. It's a desperate gamble by a high command that sees the window of opportunity closing. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. The immediate catalyst for this change is environmental and operational. The autumn Rasputitsa, the deep mud that grips the Donbass, has arrived, rendering the light vehicles and the slow-moving infantry infiltration tactics completely ineffective. The only vehicle capable of maintaining any semblance of momentum in the mud is heavy armor. The command is now forced to choose between completely halting its offensive operations until spring, or committing its armored reserves to the drone-saturated battlefield. They chose the latter, revealing their strategic desperation. This decision is fueled by a profound political necessity, the need to break the Dobropoli stalemate. The infamous 17-kilometer penetration achieved through light infantry tactics, which created the Dobropoli salient, has become a strategic liability. The Russian forces were trapped in a vulnerable operational bag, constantly threatened by Ukrainian counterattacks. The initial strategy was to hold the salient and force a Ukrainian collapse. It failed. Now, the new objective is a desperate, massive push to stabilize this pocket, capture key logistics hubs like those near Myrnograd, and launch a final assault on Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk before winter sets in. The troops committed to this brutal escalation are drawn from the most notorious ranks of the Russian military. The assault is spearheaded by the 155th Marine Brigade, notorious for its catastrophic, suicidal columns during the Battle for Vuhledar, and led by the legendary General Sukrab Akhmedov, a commander whose love of head-on mechanized assaults is well known and often fatal. This choice of leadership and unit signals a profound and terrifying commitment to an outdated, high-casualty doctrine. The Kremlin is literally betting on a commander whose track record is defined by spectacular failures and immense unnecessary losses. This entire sequence of events proves that the war is being dictated by internal contradictions. The Russian military had been hoarding its armored reserves for months, knowing that the tanks and BMPs are now highly vulnerable. Now they are being forced to commit these precious assets, estimated to be a few hundred tanks and armored vehicles, not for a guaranteed breakthrough, but for a high-risk operation on a battlefield that is known to be saturated with the most effective Ukrainian anti-tank units, the Azov National Guard Corps, the elite paratroopers, and the hardened 93rd Mechanized Brigade. The stage is set for a massive, bloody encounter that will either finally break the front or consume Russia's last significant armored reserves. The next few weeks will decide the final status of Russia's ability to wage an offensive war.
We've established the terrifying return of the mechanized columns under General Akhmedov. But this brutal tactical escalation is merely the outward sign of a far deeper, unresolvable problem: the complete and systemic exhaustion of Russia's strategic military resources. The Russian war machine is not just slowing down, its conveyor belt of death has been functionally broken by an unsustainable rate of loss, both in human capital and critical materiel. The first and most enduring evidence of this exhaustion is the irreplaceable loss of human capital. The Russian General Staff has spent the last 3 years in a desperate, self-defeating campaign of attrition. The continuous fighting has consumed the vast majority of the Russian army's professional corps. The military is now forced to rely on a failing contract system that, by the most critical internal estimates, is barely managing to close the immediate gaps created by casualties, let alone generate the hundreds of thousands of fresh troops required for victory. The losses have become a vicious, self-destructive cycle. The army consumes its professional assets, replaces them with poorly motivated and quickly trained recruits, and the subsequent high casualty rate demands yet more unsustainable spending and recruitment drives. The exhaustion of the human resource is the clearest sign of a strategic campaign that has failed its most basic mandate. Compounding this human crisis is the terminal depletion of materiel. The initial narrative of unlimited Soviet stockpiles has been exposed as a myth. Based on the latest open-source intelligence and satellite analysis, the Russian military has burned through over 50% of its total pre-war reserves of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. Specific categories of modern and highly functional Soviet-era tanks have been virtually exhausted. While thousands of units remain in storage, the crucial detail is their condition. The vast majority are in poor or unusable states, requiring months of maintenance and massive industrial expenditure to be rendered combat-ready. Russia can no longer simply pull a tank from the shelf to replace a battlefield loss. It must rebuild a relic. This material scarcity is precisely why the return of the mechanized column is a desperate gamble, not a sign of recovery. The tanks and BMPs now being committed near Pokrovsk are not surplus. They are part of a precious, finite reserve that was deliberately hoarded for a final decisive operation or for defense against NATO. Committing them now in an aggressive, high-risk manner shows that the Russian command believes their window of opportunity is closing. They are being compelled to risk these last reserves because the political pressure to demonstrate success before winter arrives and before the inevitable financial contraction of the war budget is overwhelming. This deployment is a zero-sum game. If these columns are destroyed, Russia will have no significant armored reserve left to conduct offensive operations, leaving the army functionally dependent on the slow, costly infantry tactics that have already proven to be a strategic dead end. The final verdict on the state of the Russian military is that it is trapped in a war of numbers it cannot win. It is fighting an opponent who is technologically superior on the tactical level and whose resources are being constantly replenished by the West. The summer campaign failed because Russia's command was structurally incapable of generating the required momentum. Now, the commitment of these final reserves confirms that the Russian war machine is in its final phase of self-exhaustion, trading its strategic future for a few more days of localized, costly offensive action.
We have analyzed the desperation driving the return of Russian mechanized columns. But this tactical pivot is failing because it crashes directly into the formidable wall of technology that Ukraine has erected, a multi-layered defense that ensures any conventional breakthrough is instantly neutralized. The Ukrainian front stands firm because it has replaced vulnerable human lines with a superior technological ecosystem. The core of this defense is not the soldier in the trench, but the omnipresent drone. Ukraine has achieved and maintained drone supremacy in the low-altitude airspace, creating a pervasive kill zone over the battlefield. This dominance is not accidental. It is the result of years of adaptation and rapid industrial scaling. Any concentration of Russian forces, whether the returning mechanized columns or the smaller infiltration units, is instantly identified, tracked, and targeted. The airspace above the front line is a relentless surveillance network that eliminates the element of surprise, which is vital for any successful offensive. This aerial superiority renders Russia's old and new tactics equally suicidal. The returning armored columns, despite crude attempts at adding anti-drone armor, cope cages, and turtle shells, are easily neutralized. The Ukrainian Defense Forces, including the elite Azov National Guard Corps and the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, have mastered the art of counter-armor warfare. The strategy is simple and lethal. use reconnaissance drones to locate the moving column 15 to 20 kilometers out, guide artillery and GMLRS systems onto the primary road, and then unleash a swarm of FPV kamikaze drones to finish off the pinned-down vehicles. The high-resolution video evidence confirms that Russian columns are often destroyed long before they reach their intended objective, proving that their high-mobility reserves are easily turned into burning scrap metal. The subsequent tactical counterstrike by Ukraine further reinforces this technological wall. The Ukrainian military does not merely defend, it quickly eliminates the breach. Their reserves are highly mobile and equipped to fight the new war. Against the small, lightly armed Russian infantry that manages to survive the initial drone attack and infiltrates forward, Ukraine immediately deploys heavy armor, tanks and fighting vehicles, and unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs. This creates a lethal asymmetry that Russian infiltrators, relying on small arms and minimal anti-tank capacity, are powerless against the protected, mobile, and drone-coordinated Ukrainian armor that is quickly dispatched to clean out the rear. This immediate counterpunch, which seals the breaches and annihilates the isolated pockets, proves that infiltration is not a path to victory, but a guaranteed route to heavy losses. The failure of the Russian mechanized push is not a tactical accident. It is the inevitable consequence of a clash between two fundamentally different doctrines. The Russian military, trapped by its own high command's adherence to outdated strategy, is being forced to spend its precious, finite reserves on tactics that have already been proven obsolete. The wall of technology holds firm, and it is the single most important factor ensuring that the strategic objectives of the Russian army remain eternally out of reach.
We have analyzed the military failure on the ground. But the most destabilizing force in the Russian war effort is not Ukrainian artillery. It is the deliberate and grotesque lie being told by the Kremlin. A virtual war fought on fictitious maps that completely blinds the command structure to the reality of its own defeat. This disconnect between propaganda and the truth is accelerating the system's collapse and fueling a rising tide of panic. The central lie originates at the highest levels of the Russian military. The general staff, operating under the assumption that they must report only good news, continues to present the leader with wildly inflated figures of territorial gain and military success. This virtual map is a masterpiece of political fiction. Key Ukrainian strongholds like Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, and Kostiantynivka are depicted as being almost fully controlled or successfully encircled. This is pure fantasy. The Z-bloggers themselves, the army's most dedicated chroniclers, have repeatedly exposed these maps as schizophrenic and utter nonsense, showing a profound visible rift between the war of the generals and the war of the soldiers. This vicious cycle of deception creates a disastrous strategic problem. The political leadership, relying on this fictional map, orders their troops to push forward and secure objectives that have already been repelled or never even captured in the first place. This subjects Russian forces to suicidal missions based on a lie, accelerating the rate of attrition and consuming precious resources. The High Command is literally sacrificing its most valuable assets, the last armored reserves and elite infantry, to uphold a propaganda victory that exists only on paper. The true consequences of this lie are threefold. First, moral collapse. The soldiers on the front lines, fighting for their lives, know the truth. They know their commanders are lying about their position, their supplies, and their objectives. This profound betrayal by the command structure is a systemic source of demoralization, fueling the crisis of desertion and the total loss of faith in leadership. The soldier's sacrifice is made meaningless by the knowledge that their lives are being spent to sustain a political narrative, not to achieve a military victory. Second, strategic paralysis. The massive public discrepancy between the official Russian figures and those of independent analysts confirms that the Kremlin's political legitimacy is now under constant, intense pressure. The military leadership, in a state of self-preservation, is now primarily concerned with managing the narrative rather than managing the war. Their priority is to continue to lie about the pace of the offensive and the casualty count, guaranteeing that the military decisions made are politically safe, not militarily effective. This paralysis ensures that the army remains incapable of the rapid, flexible adaptation required to win a modern war. Third, the failure of attrition. The summer offensive was meant to break Ukraine's will and resources. Instead, it exposed the profound limits of Russia's own capabilities. The vast effort to achieve a breakthrough was stymied by a simple truth: the enemy adapted faster. The significant drop in the rate of occupation, even according to the most favorable estimates, proves that the enormous sacrifice of manpower and materiel has not translated into strategic success. The front holds firm not because of a lack of Russian effort, but because the Kremlin strategy is based on a fundamental lie about its own military capacity. The virtual war has guaranteed that the real war remains unwinnable.
We have meticulously analyzed the systemic failure of the Russian offensive, the destruction of its reserves, the tactical paralysis, and the grotesque system of deception that governs its high command. But the final, most crucial conclusion is not about the Russian failure. It is about the ultimate strategic consequence of that failure. The stalemate is not a static condition. It is the active mechanism guaranteeing Ukraine's long-term victory. The verdict is sealed by the quantifiable data: the catastrophic decline in the rate of occupation, the massive, unsustainable cost of the offensives, and the profound strategic incompetence displayed by the Russian command. The summer campaign was Russia's final, grand attempt to win a war of maneuver, and its failure has confirmed that the military is structurally incapable of achieving its political goals. The vast expenditure of human and materiel resources has yielded only a positional deadlock, and that deadlock has now become the primary mechanism of Russian self-exhaustion. The entire front holds firm because the technological adaptation of the Ukrainian defense has proven superior to the outdated doctrine of the aggressor. This tactical resilience has a decisive strategic impact. The war has entered a phase where the only path to victory for Russia, the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of new troops, is a political execution that the regime is too terrified to authorize. The system is consuming itself. The leadership is forced to maintain the pretense of victory, even as the military's internal reports scream of depletion and failure. This gap between the propaganda and the battlefield is the final structural flaw that guarantees Russia's defeat. The Kremlin is unable to correct the military problem because the political cost of correcting it is too high. The core of the matter is that the front is held by a superior, evolving military doctrine. The Ukrainian military's ability to create lethal drone kill zones, to instantly neutralize the Russian armored threat, and to counter aggressive infiltration tactics with flexible technologically enabled response teams proves that the strategic initiative now belongs entirely to Kyiv. The battle is no longer about who has the most tanks, but who has the most intelligent, adaptable tactics. And the summer proved definitively that Ukraine is winning the war of adaptation. The ultimate consequence of this tactical victory is the terminal erosion of Russia's warfighting capacity. With resources dwindling, the economy collapsing under sanctions and internal mismanagement, and the political will of the leadership focused on evasion rather than resolution, the entire Russian effort is on an irreversible path to systemic defeat.
The inability of the Russian military to achieve its goals, its reliance on fraudulent reports, and its self-destructive tactics are all symptoms of a regime that has lost its strategic purpose. The war will conclude not with a grand treaty, but with the moment the Russian state realizes it can no longer afford to sustain its army or maintain the fragile social contract with its population. The stalemate is the victory.